This is NatSec Matters.
I'm host Michael Allen with Beacon Global Strategies. Today I'm joined by Roger Zakheim, the Washington director of the Ronald Reagan Presidential Foundation and Institute. Mr. Zakheim joins us today to discuss the recently released National Security Strategy, as well as the recently released Reagan National Defense Survey. The survey is a national public opinion poll that since 2018 measures how the American people understand key defense and national security issues. Please stay with us as we go to Roger Zakheim. Roger Zakheim, welcome to NatSec Matters.
Thanks for having me, Michael.
Well, Roger, we have so much to talk about. We're really happy to have you on the show. We want to talk about the National Security Strategy, which came out recently. We want to talk about, simultaneously, the poll that your organization, the Reagan Institute, released around its most recent conference, the Reagan National Defense Forum, which is held annually in Simi Valley at the library. And any takeaways generally from that conference, which is the premier defense conference in the world, certainly, easily in the United States. But let's start with the National Security Strategy. Can you summarize a little bit about what were the major takeaways? And then I'd love to hear a little bit. I'm sure you have a critique of it. Most people have some commentary on it, and just sort of tell me what you thought about it.
Absolutely. And I'm one of those people that really likes to focus on national security strategies. I think they're important as a document for an administration to set priorities and make clear to our friends and foes, allies, and adversaries in terms of what the United States cares about and where it will focus. So as a baseline matter, maybe it sounds inside the beltway, but I think these documents are important. And they're important, most importantly, because you have the president's signature on it. And I guess my top line takeaway is pleasantly surprised and pleased with the outcome, because it reflected that really what the president's shown since he's been back in office in January, that America needs to lead in the world, and particularly in the three regions that matter most to American security and prosperity. That's Indo-Pacific, Europe, and the Middle East. Not at all surprised, rightfully so, the emphasis on the homeland for previous national security strategies, and certainly the Trump administration made it clear multiple times that they were departing from previous administrations. You had sort of just an obligatory reference to the homeland being that's the number one interest, protecting the homeland. And of course, with the Trump administration, they really mean it, and they include the Western Hemisphere as part of an extension of the homeland, which gets rightfully a lot of attention, some praise, some concern. So I think that was the upside of it. I would say the downside, the part that we've been focusing on here, and in this respect, Michael, it connects to the survey as well, because I don't think it aligns with the views of the American people. The national security strategy, for reasons we could discuss, did not name America's adversaries. It did not refer to the People's Republic of China as an adversary. It did not name Russia as an adversary. It did so with respect to Iran. And that's a huge missed opportunity when you have a strategy document, because if you can't identify your adversaries, you're likely not going to be able to mitigate the threat that they pose. And as you know well, they pose significant threats, and increasingly working together. And we can talk about why, but part of that, in my mind, reflects the Trump administration's, specifically as it relates to People's Republic of China, dollar diplomacy and the pursuit of a $40 trillion American economy, which is a great goal. I'm just not confident that the PRC is a pathway to get there.
Well, let's get into the PRC, and maybe we ought to mention, and I want to hear about what the poll found in this regard, but it feels like there's a little bit of a change between Trump 1 and Trump 2 on China policy. It feels like they were much more hawkish last time. And this time it seems to be only virtually about trade. And I wonder if you agree with that assessment, and how do you think that the American people see China based on the results of your survey?
I agree with you. The last Trump administration, the last national security strategy that they put out was a really important document. It was a paradigm shift in terms of its focus on the People's Republic of China. You and I grew up in a Washington, D.C., where everybody knew about the China threat, but they were still sort of too concerned about naming it and worried that it would interfere with the aspiration that somehow China would sort of discipline and move away from its communist instincts and enter the Western markets, and perhaps through the Western markets, a Western form of government. By the time the Trump administration came around in 2017, they were like, this is working against us. It needs to stop, and rightfully named the PRC as an adversary. We're not seeing it in this national security strategy. And I think for reasons that you mentioned, the trade opportunities, the need, President Trump's going to meet with President Xi at least 2 times in the next year or so. And I think the writers of this national security strategy didn't want to do anything that would move that diplomacy off course. But the reality is that the American people have a clear-eyed view about the People's Republic of China. They see China as the greatest threat to the United States. There isn't even a close second. I mean, next is 20. When we asked that question, China, 48% said China. The next in line was Russia, 26%. When you ask the American people how they view a country as an ally or an adversary, 76% view China as an adversary. And we asked the American people, should we have a military big enough to prevail in a conflict with China? They overwhelmingly say yes. And they got a variety of other questions here, which demonstrates the American people have a pretty sophisticated understanding of the threat posed by China. And we should talk, Michael, about, relatedly, how the American people view Taiwan and what U.S. policy should be towards Taiwan.
Well, that's where I was going to go next. And for me to be fair about what's in the national security strategy, it definitely had a lot of language on generally what people in our field have called deterrence by denial, which to me is setting the theater with U.S. firepower and arming the Taiwanese to deter the Chinese from a cross-straits invasion. And there was language there about how important that region is economically to the United States. So that was sort of the other side of the coin on the national security strategy, other than the trade issues. But, I have a little bit of a thesis on Taiwan. I don't know why presidents haven't addressed it more often as a huge issue for the United States if Taiwan were to fall. But what did the poll find? Do the American people sort of get it? Would they support using U.S. force for the protection of Taiwan, or is not really that far?
It's remarkable how hawkish the American people are as it relates to Taiwan. And I think in this respect, as you rightfully note, the Trump national security strategy actually aligns with, or American people align with, the Trump national security strategy. Depends on, I guess, your point of view. But as you note, this national security strategy calls for a favorable conventional military balance as an essential component of strategic competition. And, Taiwan is rightly a focus, and they name a number of reasons for that. Semiconductors, direct access to second island chain, 1/3 of global shipping passed through the South China Sea. All this is why the Trump national security strategy says we need to deter conflict over Taiwan. And ideally, the Trump strategy says by preserving military overmatch. That's excellent language in the national security strategy. The American people view Taiwan as an ally, 67%. That's what comes out of our survey. When we ask the question, how important is it for the U.S. military to defend Taiwan against Chinese aggression? 77% say it's important. So this is not sort of just a majority. Overwhelming supermajority of Americans think this is important. And then when we ask why is it important to defend Taiwan, we give a variety of responses because Taiwan is an ally, defending democracy, economic reasons such as supply chains, stopping Chinese expansion, all the things that an inside the Beltway national security expert would outline. The American people see it all, and it's roughly evenly distributed across that. And one more, Michael, which I think really was very revealing in the survey, we said that even though Chinese policy is that, is for Taiwan to be part of China, and we explained that Taiwan has been operated independently for decades, we asked if China invaded Taiwan, and that was a key point. We say, if China invaded Taiwan, would you support or oppose coming to Taiwan's defense in the following ways? Okay, so that was a question we asked. When we asked about, well, would you respond to an invasion by officially recognizing Taiwan as an independent country, 79% supported that, up 6% from the last time. We asked, what about moving U.S. military assets, including an aircraft carrier, into the region? 70% supported that. Stick with me here because it gets even, I think, more robust in terms of the support. What about establishing a no-fly zone? 62% support that, up 11% from a year ago when we asked that question. What about sending more military equipment to Taiwan? Now it's at 71%. Up 15% when we last asked that question. And then the one that really surprised me, we asked, what about committing U.S. forces to the defense of Taiwan? Again, if China invaded Taiwan, 60% supported that, up 12% from the last time we asked that question. So we clearly see here that if
up 12%?
Correct, up 12%. If Xi were to make that decision to invade Taiwan, President Trump, should he want to get the U.S. involved economically, diplomatically, or with our own military to defend Taiwan, to defend against Chinese aggression, he is seeing a groundswell of support from the American people.
Well, to me, this is really important that the administration embrace parts of this survey to outline that the American people do support more hawkishness, especially on Taiwan, in our China policy, because I think that's an important part of deterrence. It's not just setting the theater with military hardware. It's reminding the Chinese that we have enough intestinal fortitude to really protect Taiwan at the end of the day. And they need to be convinced politically that we're credible when we say, do not mount a cross-straits invasion.
Yeah, I'm thinking about sending the survey over to Beijing and maybe renaming it the Reagan National Deterrence Survey, because the American people here are showing a lot of backbone, and it should make autocrats think twice, sort of tongue-in-cheek. But the reality is that oftentimes we are told that autocrats look at our democracy as a weakness. Meaning, yeah, you can have the strong military, but if the people aren't behind it or they lose attention or aren't committed, our enemies will exploit our democratic republic. Well, Xi should chew on this for a little bit because I think it's actually counter to what maybe people around him are saying.
All right, so just to finish on China, I think I've heard people sort of wish that the president had been more clear-eyed about, let's call it punitive actions we would have taken against the Chinese. But all in all, decent things in the strategy on Taiwan and in general. Maybe we wish it was a little bit more hawkish towards the Chinese, but that's where the president is. Let's move over to Europe.
Hey, one more, Michael, if you don't mind, before we jump to Europe, because we asked a question that at the time we knew was sort of relevant, but didn't quite know where it would land as a matter of policy. And the question we were asking was, should the United States send its chips to China, or would you support holding them back? Now, we were out in the field asking these questions at the end of October, early November, so before the recent announcement by the Trump administration that it would send NVIDIA chips or allow NVIDIA to sell its chips to China. But what we saw in the survey was that, yes, they would absolutely, as the American people would absolutely support a policy that would hold back on sending that technology nearly a supermajority of Americans would back that. So those so-called China hawks that would say, hey, this is a bad idea. We should not put this technology in the hands of the Chinese, have the backing, significant backing of the American people.
That's good stuff. Okay.
All right, Europe.
Let's go over to Europe. There's been a lot of controversy over on the continent about what is in the national security strategy. Part of it is to be expected. That President Trump wants them to spend more on their military. The president indicated what I think we all know, which is that he wants to have a better relationship, a more stable relationship with China. But there were other parts that I think the Europeans were outraged about, and it was this language on civilizational erasure. It was about economic stagnation, which I think the European Union's own documents, the Draghi report, sort of support that conclusion that it's such a regulatory superstate that it's really hard to get things done over there. But generally speaking, it didn't feel like there was a big embrace of the continent as still integral to U.S. defense and part of our, allies around the world that are always going to stand with us. And I think it was obviously received poorly in Europe. What did you think of the national security strategy's treatment of this region?
A couple of things. I think you frame it well. The first is, it struck me that the national security strategy was, as it relates to Europe, was one of those instances where it was reflecting the views of the advisors, the people around the president, far more, I thought, than the president himself. In other words, some lines in this national security strategy, you can close your eyes if someone were to read it to you, and you could hear President Trump say those words, right? This is one where you can hear the vice president, you hear some other people, but doesn't really sound very Trumpy. I mean, President Trump doesn't talk about civilizational self-confidence. That's just not, for a document that I think did a great job of being written in a common sense, everyday person's way, departing from the elite establishment that uses big words and concepts that are relevant to American people, which is one of their objectives in writing this national security strategy. The language as it relates to Europe really struck me as un-Trump-like. All right, so that's one point. The second point is, I thought the coverage of it and what alienated the Europeans was missing the other slice of it, the other half. Because what you're getting from this strategy, what I get from this strategy, it relates to Europe, is sort of a Rumsfeldian critique of old Europe and an embrace of new Europe. And here, if you look at this strategy, one of the most important bullet points to me that they include in this section of what do we want in and from the world, they said, we want to support our allies, this is a direct quote, Michael, in preserving the freedom and security of Europe. That is the right starting point.
Yeah.
While restoring Europe's civilizational self-confidence and Western identity. Now, to me, that because of language later on that you reference, people forget that framing, and that framing I think is spot on. Again, it doesn't sound to me like President Trump. I don't think he thinks about civilizational self-confidence, but the proposition is spot on. Support our allies in preserving the freedom and security of Europe. That's what we should be doing, and our survey certainly reflects that. And I think that that is something we can all get behind.
Well, let's talk in particular about burden sharing. Was that part of the survey? I'm sure the American people support that. And I think that's a way to begin to talk about the president's Ukraine policy. But generally speaking, are they in line with what the president says of Europeans need to carry more of the load and we in general ought to be focusing on other regions in the world?
Absolutely. I think the president's absolutely transformed the way the American people look at NATO. The survey focuses on NATO, or a survey that asks questions about national security and defense and foreign policy, as we've discussed. When we think about Europe, we're less focused on the EU and more focused on NATO, which is a distinction with a difference, because we hear a lot of people work within the Trump administration say that NATO is welcome and good. And that's one side of Europe. And then the EU side of Europe is a side that is very troubling for U.S. policy. And I think there's some wisdom there, maybe slightly overdone by the people inside the Trump administration. But our survey focuses on NATO. And this is fantastic. We asked, do you have a favorable or unfavorable view of NATO? We've been asking this question since 2018, Michael. We got the highest level of support for NATO since we started the survey at 68%. And what's driving that number up is those who identify as MAGA voters. So MAGA voters are driving up the support for NATO. We've always had strong Democratic support. It was 80%. Now we have 60% of Republicans. But that's not the only one. If you don't mind, I'm going to indulge a little bit more on the NATO side.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
Well, how do you explain this? I mean, all we hear, I think from our leadership anyway, is that the Europeans are free riders, that NATO's obsolete, that it's encroached too far eastward towards Russia. It just feels like they've been getting a lot of bad press, and yet the American people support for it is surging. How do you go figure?
It's President Trump's diplomacy. So once President Trump, and NATO's done a nice job in responding. The fact that NATO allies committed to 5% of their GDP towards defense, 3.5% direct, 1.5% in support of, was a paradigm shift in the way that the president thinks about NATO. It is direct response to the free rider challenge, the free rider problem, which you note. And now Secretary General Rutte is persona grata inside the White House. He is somebody that the president likes, and he's done, I think, a great job of bringing together the United States and the rest of the alliance, and we're seeing it in the survey. Let me give you one more, which blew me away. We asked, and we explained it. We asked about Article 5, the collective security provision in the NATO Charter, and explained it, that NATO members are required to respond if one country in the alliance is attacked. This is called the collective defense principle. Knowing this, would you support or oppose the U.S. responding with military force if a NATO ally in Europe was attacked? So this is not some political survey trying to drive a response you want. We lay it out there. If you are an isolationist, if you're a skeptic of NATO, you have all the information here to say, I do not support. And 76% of those surveyed support. 76%, up 5 points from the last time we asked. On Article 5, which, of course, if you're somebody who wants to avoid forever wars, keep American boots out of Europe, certainly if it relates to a conflict, we're not talking about forward presence being on military bases to prevent conflict. The question's about Article 5 to be put into conflict. 75% support. To me, that is all tied to President Trump's diplomacy and the success of NATO to, address what has been a deficiency in terms of investing in their own defense.
Fascinating. We're going to take a quick break, and we'll be right back with more of our discussion with Roger Zakheim.
Beacon Global Strategies is the premier national security advisory firm. Beacon works side by side with leading companies to help them understand national security policy, geopolitical risk, global technology policy, and federal procurement trends. Beacon's insight gives business leaders the decision advantage. Founded in 2013, Beacon develops and supports the execution of bespoke strategies to mitigate business risk, drive growth, and navigate a complex geopolitical environment. With a bipartisan team and decades of experience, Beacon provides a global perspective to help clients tackle their toughest challenges.
Let's go to Ukraine. Our friend Mark Thiessen writes frequently. I think he wrote it last year when your survey came out, and he's written it again this year. Mm-hmm. And the gist of it is, hey, MAGA, the American people actually support Ukraine. And you wouldn't know it sometimes when you maybe look at some of the rhetoric, but it's a trend, and people understand the importance of it. Do I have that right? And what does the survey say about Ukraine?
You do have it right. And it's actually even stronger than the way you stated it. It's, hey, isolationist voices that are trying to speak for MAGA voters, you're actually misrepresenting their point of view. MAGA voters are overwhelmingly, in our survey, committed to the U.S. leading in the world. So leading in the world and then specifically defeating Russia and behind Ukraine. So leading in the world, our survey showed that 64% overall want the United States to lead in the world. MAGA voters are at 79%. When we asked, do you view Ukraine as an ally, 73% of MAGA voters view Ukraine as an ally. 73%, Michael. Mm-hmm. When we ask about providing weapons to Ukraine directly between the United States, from the United States to Ukraine, 62% support. What about having Europe buy U.S. weapons and Europe providing them to the Ukrainians? 78% of MAGA support that. When we ask if they view Russia as an ally or an enemy, 74% of MAGA voters view Russia as an enemy. And then this is some of the specific questions, which I know you spend a lot of time writing on and thinking about. What about a preferred solution to resolving the conflict between Russia and Ukraine? Okay. So we give a few options. What about supporting Ukraine's defense of its full territorial sovereignty until all the Russian occupied territory is liberated? So in other words, the maximalist position. 33% of MAGA voters support that. The alternative, or one of the alternatives, was just conceding territory to Russia in exchange for a long-standing ceasefire with the security guarantees, which of course they're trying to work out right now as we're talking, from Western countries to prevent future Russian aggression. That is probably an agreement that Vladimir Zelensky would sign up for. 32% of MAGA voters support that. So you combine them together, 64% of MAGA voters would support either full territorial sovereignty and return of Russian-occupied territory, or a long-standing ceasefire with security guarantees from Western countries for Ukraine. The other position, which is a temporary ceasefire without formally recognizing Russian control of annexed territories, only 22% got that overall. So you could see that the president's core coalition, those who voted for him, are squarely behind an outcome that protects the free people of Ukraine.
So, Roger, politics and communication strategy are, hard to pull off in a city where there's dozens of issues percolating on any given day. But does the White House know about where your poll is on some of these issues, and why is there just this overwhelming narrative that MAGA is strictly neo-isolationist, wants us to do less in the world, doesn't care about Ukraine, and isn't preoccupied with China? I mean, that there seems to be a real disconnect between the conventional wisdom and the way people actually feel.
Well, we're certainly working on that to make sure from the president on down, they understand where the American people are coming out on this. And in many respects, I think the survey shows or reflects actually the president's point of view. So let's distinguish between the sort of reputation of what MAGA is or what certain elements of administration would want. The president is not isolationist. He's not neo-isolationist. The president, since January, has shown himself to be, without question, an American primacist. He wants America everywhere in the world, winning everywhere in the world. So he wants America present in the world and kicking ass in the world. And the survey actually shows the American people back him on those grounds. I mean, we didn't talk about targeting of narco-terror boats in the Western Hemisphere, but there's 60% support for that. 90% of MAGA back that. So what you're seeing in the survey is actually, in my judgment, a reflection of how they view the president and what the presidents want to do, and he's driving this as much as anything else. And we're getting in there at the Reagan National Defense Forum, as you referenced. We were talking about the survey a lot, and there were senior administration officials there from the Pentagon. So they know this. And what we encourage them to do is leverage it. This is added firepower. You don't only have to give your own personal viewpoint or the administration's point of view, but you could say the American people are behind you, and we'll keep on doing them by having conversations like this.
All right, well, let's talk about the Middle East. The president seems to express a preference in its national security strategy for making it less about security issues and counterterrorism and making it more about artificial intelligence, civilian nuclear agreements, and economic development in general. But at the same time, it's sort of signaling that the Middle East isn't as important to us as it has been historically as this source of energy, or that we needed to keep strategic stability there. Talk a little bit about how you think the Trump administration is. Would you agree that they're downgrading the Middle East as an important region in the world?
Yeah, I don't agree with that, but it could be I'm grading on a curve. I think if you look at the restrainer camp inside the administration, or neo-isolationist camp, the point of view inside the administration that would like the U.S. military to do less, to focus elsewhere, either at home or maybe in the Indo-Pacific, you would have assumed that you would have had a severe downgrade in the Middle East. And I read the words, and I don't see it that way. I mean, you look at the same section at the start of the national security strategy. What do we want in and from the world? After talking about the Indo-Pacific, after talking about Europe, it talks about the Middle East. We want to prevent an adversarial power from dominating the Middle East, its oil and gas supplies, and the choke points through which they pass, right? So that's classic national security strategy across Republican and Democratic administrations. And that says, while avoiding, quote, the forever wars that bogged us down in the region at great cost. And we want to ensure that U.S. technology, to the point you made, and U.S. standards and AI, biotech, elsewhere drive the world forward. So, from that framing, I'm quite comfortable with it. The demagoguery of the forever wars we could talk about another time. It's sort of just become part of the parlance of President Trump's administration and, frankly, the Obama and Biden administration, too. We could note that Iraq recently had a successful election, and because of Israel's work and the administration's work in Iran, we actually have a successful nascent democracy in Iraq. But putting that aside, I think it's fine. What we need to look at is this national defense strategy, which we got a little bit of a taste of at the Defense Forum, but we haven't seen it in print. And we got to see what happens with U.S. forces in the Middle East. Are we going to reduce the footprint there severely? Or are we going to modify it? I think you and I would probably agree we can shift some resources from the Middle East, from the CENTCOM area of responsibility to the Indo-Pacific. But we need to maintain a presence there to buck up our allies and deter adversaries, even with a weakened Iran. And that's what we got to watch from the administration going forward. Frankly, the biggest shifts we've seen from a force presence standpoint that would concern me is in Europe, with forces being taken out of Romania, albeit they were rotational forces. They were an important signal to Vladimir Putin. Haven't seen that as much in the Middle East, and that's what I think we need to watch.
Well, I was going to say much the same thing, which is that I could probably stomach some movement of troops out of the Middle East, depending on where. It's the signal that fewer troops in Europe send to NATO and to Russia that bothers me. Roger, among the many things that you're an expert in, it's definitely the case that you understand Israel better than most. You have family there. You and I have traveled there. I wonder if you might just remind the American people, what are the United States' interests in Israel? Why should we continue to support a strong Israel? Is that among the top objectives for U.S. national security policy, or should it be?
Well, I think it's a great partnership for the United States. And as you think about the Middle East region, it's the best partnership. I tend to start with values. Some don't. But if you start with values, it is the only democracy in the Middle East. We share the value of having a government led by its people with a free society and a free market. That's our democratic republic. That is the only democracy in the Middle East that is aligned on that level. That's on the political level and the value level. And then increasingly, because Israel is this miracle, it has transformed itself to startup nation. Our friend Dan Senior has written about this, and it's only increased. So from a technology standpoint, and this technology drives their economy and their security, it's actually increasingly a contributor to our economy and to our security interests. When you and I worked on Capitol Hill, almost 15 years ago, I would say the security relationship between Israel and the United States was unbalanced. That it was Israel really relied upon security assistance, sharing of intelligence, information, and like. It was in the United States' interest to have Israel as a bulwark against our common adversaries. But fast forward 15 years later, it's far more of a partnership where the United States also relies on Israel's eyes and ears, and you know a lot about that. Probably stuff you can't share in this conversation. That's increased. And from a technology standpoint, it's not just people on the ground, but it's actually the technology that supports that. And then I think if you had any doubt about what I've just outlined, I'll end with this. Iran is an enemy of the United States. Our survey, and that's the regime, not the people, our survey reflects that. For decades, the United States has a bipartisan objective to prevent Iran from obtaining a nuclear weapon. And we have fallen short until recently of realizing that policy objective. Thanks to Israel and their strength and courage, the United States now looks at its adversary in the Middle East, that is Iran, as a weakened adversary because of Israeli strikes against Iran's nuclear weapons program. So all those years of security assistance, the United States has received a fantastic return on investment and ultimately allowed for the Trump administration to finish their job with Operation Midnight Hammer. To me, those are the fundamentals of a very consequential, meaningful and balanced alliance between Israel and the United States.
I mean, I think the key point is that the American people and even the so-called foreign policy elite need to realize that we get things out of the relationship with Israel. It's not just a one-way street of military assistance and, subsidizing their military and having their back in the United Nations and elsewhere diplomatically around the world. We enjoy certain benefits from that partnership.
Couldn't agree with you more. That's a succinct way to put it. And our survey shows that 66% view Israel as an ally. Now, that's 57% of Democrats, 77% of Republicans. Democrats have gone down, and I think that's a function of our domestic politics and the hijacking of the progressive left of the Democratic Party, which has its sympathies for the Palestinian cause and showed itself to be sympathetic to Hamas since October 7th. That's their own sort of toxic politics that they're going to have to contend with because it's truly not where the American people are overall.
Yeah, I think that's the important feature that needs to begin to get out there. One last note on Iran. We weren't necessarily sure where the American people would be on bombing their nuclear program. But by all accounts, President Trump's actions with Midnight Hammer were a success. Did this show up in your survey that the American people appreciated that judicious use of force against the Iranian nuclear program?
Absolutely. So when we asked the question, do you approve of the U.S. military's targeted airstrike against Iran's nuclear facilities this past summer? So we're talking about Operation Midnight Hammer. 60% supported that overall. And there's a strong, as you might imagine, partisan divide there. 39% of Democrats supported that strike. 83% of Republicans backed that strike. So, you still have close to supermajority of support. We'll take 60% support in this country for anything, but it's a big partisan difference, and that may not surprise people inside Washington, given how much President Trump has emphasized this as one of his hallmark achievements. And you think about Democratic administrations. I mean, it's an unbelievable kind of rejection of their preferred approach to diplomacy in the Middle East, which was let's negotiate and try to make a deal with Iran. And the way I viewed it is leave our allies out to dry, be it Israel or our Sunni allies in the Gulf. Well, the Trump administration reversed that with an exclamation point, and it's viewed by Republicans very successful. 87% of MAGA voters support Midnight Hammer. So, I mean, it's really a strong partisan divide on that front.
Roger, let me just anticipate that someone might be surprised by this podcast and doubt that the Reagan Foundation did an honest job here, that their poll supports what our views are, which are that we want American primacy and engagement everywhere, and that we believe the United States has a unique contribution to make. What if someone said to you, well, this poll is an outlier, or you figured out a way to ask the questions in such a way to get the responses that you want? Just anticipating that critique, what would you reply with?
Go on to your browser, put in Reagan National Defense Survey 2025. We have all the data there. Crosstabs, methodology, and look for yourself. We've been doing this since 2018, so we have the trends to back it. You see how the American people are moving against it. We asked over 2,500 people participate in the survey. The margin of error is less than 2 percentage points. It's plus minus 1.96%. So, you're entitled to your point of view, but the statistics are what they are, and we're confident that this survey reflects the views of the American people.
What about just as you look over the survey, but in particular the national security strategy, what are some of the issues, and I get this question all the time, what are the issues that we're not anticipating right now? We're talking about a hot war in Europe. We just had a hot war in the Middle East and might do so again. Things are getting tense in the Pacific theater. Talk a little bit about what you think we should be worried about in the future. Did the national security strategy ignore or not cover any items that the American people should have high on their watch list?
Yeah, I got a couple of those. The American people believe that we are more likely to achieve peace if we have the world's strongest military. We asked that question, 71% agreed with that. And we asked how large the military should be to accomplish that objective, and 44% came back and said our military should be large enough to win separate wars against China and Russia at the same time. Say that one more time. The American people, 44%, thought our military should be big enough to beat China and Russia simultaneously. And then if you add the second option, large enough to win separate wars against China and a smaller country like Iran and North Korea, 20%. You add those two up, that means 64% of the people believe that we should have a military big enough to win two conflicts simultaneously. Only 10% felt that we should be large enough to win one war against China, but not a second war. The reality is, as you know well, is that our military is not sized, definitely not sized to prevail in two conflicts simultaneously, even against the second being a smaller power. And it's debatable whether we could prevail in a conflict against China, certainly within 1,000 nautical miles of China's border. And then we ask questions about defense technology, and you can see the American people perhaps are clear-eyed about whether we're leading in satellites and rockets and robotics and artificial intelligence. They think we're one of the best, which is correct, but not many, less than half, think that we're the best in the world in those categories. And, to me, that's the challenge. Are we going to be a country with a military that's sized to actually deter the sorts of wars that if we're in, we have to win? And are we going to have the technology and capability that could prevail over the adversary? I mean, do we have the best class of weapons? And that's what we have to keep on looking at, because right now I think there's a gap between what the American people expect and what we can actually deliver.
Roger, this reminds me that you were on the very esteemed bipartisan commission on the national defense. And that commission, I think summer before last, made a series of important recommendations about defense spending given the threat picture around the world. Will you summarize for our listeners the major holdings of that particular document?
Yeah, I mean, particularly as it relates to the items we were just discussing. One, we said the threat environment is the most dangerous since the Second World War. And Secretary Hegseth has pretty much said the same. He most recently at a speech at National Defense University. We also said that we need a military sized to deter this growing axis. And in the time since our report came out, the axis of adversaries, the axis of autocrats has only increased in their coordination. Of course, I'm talking about China, Russia, Iran with engagement in North Korea, Venezuela, and others. And the third thing we said was that military needed to be big enough to deal with both, with a defense budget that is not half of what we spent during Ronald Reagan's administration, but closer to it, which was 6% GDP. We're, as you know, barely at 3% GDP, which doesn't keep pace with inflation. And that matters, because if we're not growing our investment in national defense, the military is not going to grow with it. No matter how effective you are as a manager, as a green-eyed shade budget genius, you're not going to get more platforms, more people, more capability if we are not investing more in the military. And that was also captured. One thing that's lost in a national security strategy, and we'll see if it's in the national defense strategy, is discussion of budget. And in the absence of putting some budget behind these ideas, you risk those ideas just becoming words.
So the most common measuring stick for defense spending is percentage of gross domestic product.
That's right.
And I know we're significantly behind where we were at different times in the Cold War, but what were those numbers generally speaking? You mentioned the Reagan number, but generally speaking, or better, what number do we need to be at, and for how long?
So I think from a defense budget standpoint, you need annual growth that exceeds inflation. So what we put in the National Defense Strategy Commission was 3 to 5% real growth year over year. And that marker, so it's different than the GDP metric. That's just saying every year, you want to grow your business, you got to invest in your business is one way to think about it. And you need to have investment that does better than inflation. When Jimmy Carter was president, and this is generally referred to as a low watermark in terms of American strength and American national security, he was investing 4.5% GDP in defense, and they were trying to get to 5% real growth year over year. That was under Jimmy Carter. So instead of telling you the high watermark, Korea or the Reagan years, let's just talk about Jimmy Carter. We are underperforming Jimmy Carter by 1.5% GDP. We are underperforming Jimmy Carter roughly 2 to 2.5% annually in terms of investment, because he was seeking by the end of his administration to go beyond inflation, 3 to 5% above inflation. Inflation is pretty high in those days. Here, it's relatively low in comparison, and we can't keep pace. And, it's like Niall Ferguson says, a great economic historian at Hoover, you can measure a great power by their investment in their defense. And if it's declining, we will decline.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, a lot of this has to do, obviously, with U.S. economic growth and preventing stagnation and the rest. But I don't see many people outside of the Senate Armed Services Committee and the commission calling for dramatic increases in defense spending. What do we need to do? I mean, we have so many other issues that we want to inspire support for. Where do you, and I know your poll probably discussed this somewhat, but where do you think we stand on getting the president and the Congress to send us a lot more money in defense spending?
Well, first of all, I think our friend Mike Rogers, the chairman of the House Armed Services Committee, would say he's right up there with the Senate Armed Services Committee. He's called for 5% real growth, and he keeps on saying he's committed to getting that done, sort of a glide path to getting there. Pete Hegseth, the secretary, said at the Reagan National Defense Forum he expects the president to increase the defense budget. He understandably said he didn't want to get ahead of the president, but that's what he said there. So I think some of the fundamentals are in place. We had, as you know, Russ Vought, the director of the Office of Management and Budget, someone who has a history of looking at the Pentagon as a big building of bloat and was sort of loath to invest in the Pentagon. But I think he's certainly open to doing so through perhaps less traditional means. He used the reconciliation measure to invest $150 billion additional dollars into the defense budget. That, I say additional, that's added to the annual budget, which is roughly $150 billion. So we're getting towards a $1 trillion defense budget. But given the challenges we face, we need to do more, and it needs to be sustained. As you know, Michael, we can't do these continuing resolutions where we're funding at the same levels in this previous year in the same categories of spending, so you're not shifting funds towards priorities. That is super harmful, and we need to sustain it year over year. You can't have a bump in one year and then just go flat the following year, because then when you're building the aircraft carrier or the next generation unmanned fighter, they need to have that sustained funding. They don't get done. It's not like a piece of software where it gets updated, not yet at least, in 3-month increments. It takes time to yield us. We don't have the time. We need the urgency. We need to be building faster. And part of getting that achieved is through sustained investment.
Roger, thank you so much. That was a great tour of the national security strategy with a brilliant overlay of the survey results from the Reagan Institute annual poll. Thank you so much for joining NatSec Matters.
Michael, awesome to be here. Love the subject discussion and your expertise. We're always looking to collaborate with you.
That was Roger Zakheim. I'm Michael Allen. If you enjoy listening to NatSec Matters, please leave us a rating and review. We'd love to hear from you. If you're interested in becoming a sponsor, please email our team at bgs@bgsdc.com. You can also find this email in the show notes. Please join us next week for another episode of NatSec Matters.
NatSec Matters is produced by Steve Dorsey with assistance from Ashley Berry. NatSec Matters is a production of Beacon Global Strategies.